Alright, this is U.S. Survey Part 2, Chapter 4, starting on page 410. We start with the Ford administration as Nixon has now resigned post-Watergate scandal. He became the 38th president, and within a month he had pardoned Nixon for the good and the bad of it. There's a lot of Americans that hated this. But his quote is, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is now over." He thought he was doing the right thing. He wanted to put it behind us, but a lot of Americans felt like it was pretty shady. The War Powers Act of 1973 was passed. This was to limit executive power, as before this point, American presidents could do whatever they wanted to, when they wanted to, for some time, as of LBJ, where if they wanted to send in troops, they could do it. They didn't have to ask Congress for permission, etc. So this changes. The Freedom of Information Act of 1966 was also updated. The government had to justify all classification of national security secrets. Personally, Ford was a nice, honest, simple guy. He was conservative and believing in less government. But Nixon left the economy and the country in many ways in the toilet. 1975, unemployment was up to 10%. Ford accepted a tax cut in hopes of restarting the nation's economy. Kissinger was the only Nixon aide left who worked tirelessly to stabilize the Middle East, work with China. He continued détente talks with the Soviets. Ford met with Brezhnev, who was now the Soviet premier, in 1974. And he worked out SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, where it was a new nuclear arms agreement to slow down nuclear arms production. In 1975, the Soviets pledged to respect human rights, which was a pretty big deal, and Kissinger even got the Israelis and Egyptians to peace talks. At this point, we see the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and a focus on negotiating peace rather than going to war. Too bad that's not going on right now. October 1974, the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, was crossed by the North Vietnamese. Ford asked Congress to go back in, and they said, heck no, we are not doing that again, and South Vietnam fell. This really did back up that domino theory that we were fearful that when the communists began to move in, country after country would fall. And we see that happening with South Vietnam, and then Laos and Cambodia fell as well. 1976 was a good year. It was a bicentennial year, 200th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and patriotism was high. It was an election year, and Reagan ran against him with the Republican Party, but lost for now. We'll see him soon. The Democrats ended up running one Jimmy Carter. He's a new guy. He's outsider. He's honest. He is a common guy. Very informal. Came from a strong Baptist background. Promised to be a moral compass for the world and for the country. He promised to never lie. And he had a very thick Georgian accent. Who knows what would happen if voter turnout was higher, but Carter won this time. Carter's years, he appointed more blacks and Hispanics and women to his administration than ever before. He created 2 cabinet positions. One is the Department of Energy, and one was education. He also offered amnesty to draft dodgers, and he created something called the Superfund to help clean up toxic waste and sites contaminated with hazardous substances. He dealt with China, the economy, energy conservation, and nuclear power plants. These were our big problems. Foreign policy-wise, obviously I mentioned China, but we also have a problem with the Soviets. They've shut down B-1 operations, we shut down B-1 operations to try and smooth things over with the Soviets and cancel the development of the neutron bomb. In China, there were open talks with China, which angered the Taiwanese, who were leftover loyalists to the pre-communist China. Carter was a strong supporter of human rights. He worked in South America as well as Israel and Egypt, bringing them to the peace talk table in September of 1978. He was able to work out in 2 weeks of peace talks establishment of that return of Sinai to Egypt, as well as Egypt recognizing Israel as a country. A pretty big deal. 1979, we see Iran. They have a major scandal with us. We have Emperor Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who is, after 25 years of power, he's ousted, and he's replaced by an extremist cleric by the name of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And Khomeini took power, and he basically used the he unfortunately used Muslim law to rule Iran. The government was ultra-conservative Islamic. Basically, it shut down anything that was Western at all. If it at all resembled what was happening in the United States or the Western world, it was shut down. Some very basic ways that manifested itself. Let's see, women are required to cover their hair. Men were not allowed to wear shorts. They couldn't drink alcoholic beverages. No Western movies. Men and women could not swim or sunbathe together. We see the Islamic education is now complete and total, even included into university level. There is a hostage crisis as a response to our allowing of the Shah to come in and receive cancer treatment. So Pahlavi comes into the U.S. to get cancer treatment, and the Ayatollah Khomeini is so upset about this that he takes the U.S. Embassy with the 52 staff members hostage for 444 days. We also see the rise of women's liberation. Betty Friedan wrote the Feminine Mystique in 1963, who was the first to publicize the question, do you really think you're happy as a housewife? Also was responsible for founding of National Organization for Women, or NOW. Also, this movement brought about Roe versus Wade in 1973, legalizing a woman's right to an abortion. And you have the Equal Rights Amendment of 1972. It was meant to end discrimination against women, but it was never ratified. In Chapter 3 on page 617, the 1980 election is Carter versus Reagan. Carter's not popular, as anything that went wrong was blamed on him, and he saw this as a crisis of confidence within the U.S. Reagan was a Republican, took with him George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president, promised lower taxes, reducing government, reducing military spending, and rebuilding military and standing firm on communism, against communism, I should say. He also promised to restore America to its former glory. This really did tap into the nationalistic tendencies of Americans, patriotic, pro-America type thing. He did not bring up the Iran hostage crisis. This really could have been a selling point for him, but he saw that as not appropriate for political debate. He was elected on the one-year anniversary of the embassy storming, and Republicans also took the House and Senate. On his inauguration day, the hostages were freed. Some say this was a direct frustration with Carter. Reagan said, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is a problem. He came across as a hero. I kind of liken him to your grandfather that you kind of come up to because you just want to hear what he has to say and you love him and appreciate him. He was a force of nature. He's an actor, gifted speaker, straight shooter, well-liked. Personally, he was very comfortable with himself. It's during his presidency that the Challenger exploded in January of 1986, killed all the crew, and set the space program back probably about a decade. It's his eulogy of those victims that earned him the moniker the Great Communicator. There was an assassination attempt on his life in March of 1981. John Hinckley Jr., he was hit. Reagan was hit, but he survived. He's also known for his supply-side economics, or Reaganomics. This idea of dropping taxes to allow consumers' pockets to fill up so then they'd spend it. He sponsors the Economic Recovery Bill. We see a lot of cuts made in Congress to try and generate spending, and in the summer of 1983, we see the results. Unemployment had dropped almost 3%. The GNP was growing. Inflation was cut in half. There's certainly some failures that you can read about in the book. He does end up building up the military quite a bit. That does come at a cost. Brings about food stamps and housing projects, as well as a real push for education and college loans. You also see, those are some of the cuts. You also see the evil empire, this idea of we need to continue in our push against communism. The SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, this was going to protect the United States with some sort of a shield against missile attacks. You also see the Iran-Contra scandal, which you definitely need to read about, because this is where you see the cover-up and the subsequent resignation of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, as he was the one that was basically labeled for it. He was a good president in that he made tremendous headway with the economy. He was responsible for the Japanese-American Reparations Act, where the family of the Japanese Americans who had been put into internment camps during World War II were paid a small stipend, $20,000, for those that had been placed in those relocation camps. He also brought back hope and patriotism, and he pushed hard on communism. In Chapter 6, you see it as an election year in 1988. You've got kind of a plethora of pretty wild and crazy stunts happening here, running against one George Herbert Walker Bush. In so many ways, he was set up for presidency because of Reagan and his work there, but he also was a well-respected member of the military and political community as well. He had been in the Navy. He was the youngest pilot ever, shot down by the Japanese in 1944 and then rescued, remained on active duty after that, a Yale graduate. He was, in so many ways, a great guy for the job. Probably his greatest downfall was his promise of "read my lips, no new taxes." Promised to make sure that he could take care of the national debt without upping taxes, and unfortunately he could not keep that promise, and the Americans remembered it. The Cold War ended during his presidency. You have perestroika, which literally meant restructuring of the economy. You have glasnost, meaning openness or freedom of information. It's during this time that the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan. They had been in a civil war, or been involved in the civil war in Afghanistan for 9 years. When they finally pulled out, you also see kind of another reverse, I guess that'll work, reverse domino effect, in that they also pull out of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And Romania is the only one that even has any bloodshed. Otherwise, it's a very peaceful move out. On November 9th, 1989, Checkpoint Charlie was opened, and this is the Brandenburg Gate there in Berlin, and the wall came tumbling down. October 3rd, 1990, Germany was no longer divided. NATO collapsed, and you have all these countries now demanding their independence from the Soviet bloc. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Georgia, all of those countries in that particular area are now wanting to be free as well. Agreements between Bush and Gorbachev were cranked out. Gorbachev was still opposed by communist hardliners, and there's a coup that's staged. Boris Yeltsin ends up calling on the rest of the world to protect Gorbachev, and he wins the love and respect of the world. And eventually, when this all comes to a close, Gorbachev steps down, and Yeltsin becomes the new president of what's now, again, Russia. We also see communism falling in Nicaragua. First free elections in 1990. Chile, after 16 years, has free elections. South Africa's ending apartheid. China is the exception. Tiananmen Square is the location of a student-led protest march against communism, where hundreds were killed or even or hurt. Please do take a minute to Google Tiananmen Square. It's there in your book, so look up the spelling. You can watch a video. It's a news report that shows what happens here. They're not too terribly long, but it sure will enlighten you on something that is really quite remarkable. I hate that it ended in a negative way as far as the students being injured and then killed in some situations, but it does illustrate for the rest of the world that China's not as perfect as maybe they thought so before. We have issues with Panama. Manuel Noriega came to power in '83. Major problem with his drug cartels. He is preventing the United States from coming in and slowing that down. You have Saddam Hussein, who comes into play during this time period. This is the original Gulf War to try and protect and liberate Kuwait after Iran had invaded them over oil struggles in August of 1990. In November of that year, the UN Resolution 678 gave a green light for the use of force, and Operation Desert Storm opened on January 17th at 2:30 a.m. It was a short and sweet war for us. Hussein was just not prepared for us. He had old school missiles. Men were coming up with their guns in the air, I surrender, taking off their shirts, their white shirts, waving them, basically begging to be taken captive. The ceasefire removed him from Kuwait but kept him in power, which of course led to a larger problem later on. Back in the U.S., we have a rampant drug problem. By 1989, more than 1/3 babies were born already either addicts to cocaine or heroin. Tried more aggressive actions to stop or slow the drug movement through Colombia and Peru. Bush wasn't conservative enough for some. The religious leader Jerry Falwell started the Moral Majority. You have Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition, who were fighting for traditional family values. And your book puts that in quotes, and that's important because what you and I may say are traditional family values would differ to somebody else. So this defines it for you. Drug use, sexual activity among adolescents, gay rights, and abortion. Those are the big things that the traditional family values were being fought about. 1990, we see a new census that lays out where the cities are, the megacities are, where people are living, what women are doing as far as work situations. It's also going to lay out single-parent family homes, as well as the rise in AIDS, which was acquired immune deficiency syndrome, originally showing up in gay communities and then growing at a staggering rate. In Chapter 7, Bush is doing well in the polls due to his success at the Persian War, but he does have a number of problems on his own. Certainly the fallout of Read My Lips comes into play here. Clinton comes in. He's going to run as a Democrat. He's known as a draft dodger and a womanizer, and yet he still does well. He does very well with the black constituency, brings in Al Gore to be his vice president. When Clinton won, Democrats took both houses. He went straight to war. He strongly objected to the problem of gays in the military. He wanted it to be open, but he compromised with don't ask, don't tell. The national health care system, put his wife in charge of a task force to try and make that happen. Proposal didn't pass. You also see NAFTA here, the North American Free Trade Agreement, establishing a free trade zone between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. You also see the Brady Bill finally come to fruition in 1983 with gun control laws. In 1993, you have the infamous Waco, Texas incident. Do make sure to read about that. Also that year, you have the World Trade Center bombing that killed 6 people and injured thousands. 95 was the Oklahoma City bombings, where Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up a truck bomb just outside a federal building, killing 168 people. You have Newt Gingrich. He rises to power here as the new Speaker of the House in 94. You have Bob Dole, who runs in the election of 1996. He runs as a Republican. He's a a World War II vet, but he's not very dynamic. So he does not end up getting the vote out. So Clinton ends up winning again. Unfortunately, he has a bit of baggage here that comes out with the second election. He's using the Lincoln Room, allowing people, dignitaries, to pay exorbitant amount of monies that will go into his re-election war chest so they can sleep in the Lincoln Room. And there's certain controversies that happen time and again. In 93, you have the Somalia Black Hawk Down situation. In China, we granted them most favored trade status in 2000. Serbia in 1995, we went into NATO to help keep peace. And in 99, we returned because there was a problem of ethnic and genocide issues. People are being killed because of who they are, who they're related to, and their cultural backgrounds. Slobodan Milosevic is the president of Serbia at this point. He is arrested in 2001 on war crimes and crimes against humanity. He's tried and convicted, but he dies before his trial's over. In 93, you have Israel and Palestine meeting. You have peace and agreement of self-rule. Politics and impeachment goes into the Lewinsky scandal. Make sure you read about that as well. In the 90s, we have the advent, or well, the America going online. It's not the advent, as that had begun in the 60s. But in 96, we see 18 million Americans having access to the internet, and the next year there's 30 million of them. Chapter 8 talks about the 2000 election. It's the Bush-Cheney ticket, Republican, as they are going against Gore Lieberman as a Democrat. The Bush-Cheney ticket, their strategy is to be uniters, and they are Washington outsiders. Where Gore Lieberman, they're trying just to keep away from the Clinton scandal. So anything good that Clinton did, Gore couldn't claim, because if he opened the door to what Clinton, well, when I worked with Clinton, we did the such and such, it opened the door for all the bad too, which certainly hurt him as well. This is the famous election night where there's the hanging chads in Florida, the miscounting of the ballots, etc. Finally comes in where the U.S. Supreme Court intervened and Florida went to Bush. Bush was very conservative, born-again Christian, brought with him very conservative values. Very soon after he took office, 9/11 happened. A terrorist attack attached to Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes. First 2 flew into the World Trade Center, ultimately causing them to fall, with 3,000 people dying as a result of that. The third flew into the Pentagon, and the 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Al-Qaeda, you have Osama bin Laden as the claimer of all of these attacks. He's backed by the leadership of Afghanistan, which is the Taliban. Congress opened up the ability of the president. He could take whatever action he saw fit. We've heard of this before, including punishing terrorist activities. Troops went to Afghanistan. They never located bin Laden until more recently, of course, but they ended the Taliban within 6 months and brought democracy with them. Troops went into Iraq in 2003, targeting Saddam Hussein as he was a part of the axis of evil. Bush had been briefed by MI6 and CIA that there were weapons of mass destruction, and he saw that Hussein was the major contributor there. The U.S. Patriot Act of October 2001 was upped again in 2003, allowing surveillance and wiretapping of anyone considered a threat to national security. In 2004, we have another election on page 646. John Kerry and John Edwards running together against Bush and Cheney. John Kerry was not a very dynamic guy, proved to be what they call a flip-flopper. He would be televised saying one thing, and then the next event he went to televised as saying the exact opposite. And he was just caught up into that too many times, and Americans paid attention to it. And he also may have overstated his roles in Vietnam, and the Americans were very upset with that. Cheney and Bush kept the course. They wanted to see the end of Iraq, bringing the war on terror eventually to an appropriate end. They are constitutional amendments banning gay marriage. This was part of their platform, as well as their effort in the long haul with the war. They were reelected. Domestically, they were able to reform Medicare and privatize Social Security, as well as work some on immigration reform. There's a number of scandals during this time that you want to read about. In 2005, you have Scooter Libby. In 2006, you have Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi coming to important roles in power. And in 2007, he tried a surge to wrap things up in Iraq. The 2008 elections, you have Barack Obama against Joe Biden. They ran against John McCain, who shocked everyone by taking a female vice president by the name of Sarah Palin. Obama ended up winning, but his timing was pretty rough. He came in right at the end of the housing bubble, they call it, and it basically burst while he was in office. He spent his first 100 days working on the economy. You have the stimulus and cash for clunkers. He intended on closing Gitmo. Finally, that happened just very recently. This is not, I don't even know if this was mentioned in your book, but it's just happened within the last year or so. Now it's a timetable to get out of Iraq, as well as Obamacare, which we certainly are familiar with today. So much, so fast, but there is still time, right? We are a young country, which brings us a whole lot of hope. Good luck, and let me know if you've got some questions.